Is Christianity a hindrance to science, or does it indeed positively influence it? And what does such a positive influence on science and maybe even society say about the faith itself? Can we see in history which is true, if faith has promoted science or hindered it? Find out in today's episode of According to Sci-Faith. I'm Joshua Göcking, and you're listening to the English version of the podcast of Sci-Faith. At Sci-Faith, we regularly talk about that faith is not only true, but also fruitful. This fruitfulness is, of course, a consequence of the faith being true. If one assumes this to work also in the opposite direction, faith being fruitful would imply it being true. Therefore, to evaluate whether faith is based in truth, it helps to consider its fruit. But what fruit does or did the Christian faith produce? In this episode, we will take a look at the fruit that faith had throughout history, especially on science, but also on society. So, if we are talking about science, usually people think about the ancient Greeks, and while it's true that probably since the dawn of time, people have thought about or the principles of nature, thought about the laws of nature, or thought about natural occurrences, what they mean, how they come about, and so on. That in itself was not what you would mean if you would be talking about science as we talk about science today. Because science as we know it today actually came up only in the 16th and 1700s. And the reason for this is that Newton and Bacon and Kepler and Galileo and many more were developing a method, which we call the scientific method today. Before, especially also with the Greeks, they had no such method, or they had different methods, but especially the Greeks were of the opinion that if one could deduce some statement about nature perfectly without any logical errors, then they needed to be true. Then this didn't need to be checked by experiment or something else. It was just true because it was perfectly deduced. And that might be even true, but what they didn't consider was the fallibility of man. So they came to wrong conclusions which could not be recognized due to no experiments taking place. One example of this is the Ptolemaic system, which saw the Earth as the center of the solar system, which as we know today is not true. So in the 16th and 1700s, Newton, Bacon, and many others realized that that there is a need of the experiment to do proper science, or to do science effectively, and they put a lot of focus on proving their thoughts or their laws experimentally to see whether what they were talking about was indeed given in nature. And so they developed the scientific method, which took this fallibility of man into account. From this, one can see the clear Christian influence that in the development of the scientific method was given, because Newton, Kepler, Galileo, Bacon, they were all Christian thinkers, they were all Christian scientists, and their faith played a huge role in their life. Newton, for example, studied scripture for 30 years, so he was more involved in Christian theology than in science, but still was one of the founders of modern science. So this shows how string together science and faith at this time was. And not only is this shown in the fact that the creators of the scientific method, or the founders of the scientific method, were Christians, it's also seen in the basic principle on which the scientific method rests. Because as I have already said, what the scientific methods achieves is that it removes biases that come from wrong conclusions that can come basically through the fallibility of man, that man makes mistakes. And this is also already found in the Christian faith, and I believe that their faith made it possible for them to take this into account and to develop the scientific method. So, as you can see, the Christian faith played a huge role in the development of the scientific method. And one might ask, okay, but what is so special about the scientific method? Well, the scientific method led to what we call today the scientific revolution. So, since this time, there have been new big discoveries in physics every 30 years or so. So, there was an unheard of and unseen, never before seen revolution in science, where in short periods of time huge discoveries were made. And one might also ask how this can be due to the Christian faith, since the Christian faith has been there for more than 1,000 years, and by then, so and why didn't the scientific method came up earlier? And if one wants to understand this, one needs to look at something which happened at a similar time, and this is the Reformation. So the Reformation broke through under Martin Luther in Germany, but it already there were already previous reforming movements. For example, there was a Czech reformer Jan Hus and many others. And but the Catholic Church was really opposed to these movements and tried to stop them. But in the end, with Martin Luther, the Reformation could break through. And what one can see is that this Reformation brought new convictions about the faith. It brought a new it brought it back to a more biblical foundation, to what Luther called the five solas. So many things were changed there, which reformed the way in which people believed. And as I believed, this spirit of Reformation had also an effect that was more than just an effect in the faith, in the Christian faith, but also in science and society. And I think this effect led also to the scientific method being developed. But it's not the only time where the Christian faith had a positive effect on science or society. It was later that there was an English preacher called John Wesley, and he was the founder of the Methodist movement, and he was influenced by the Moravian Church. The Moravians were believers from from what's today the Czech Republic, and they need to flee from there. So they were former followers of the reformer Jan Hus, which I mentioned before, and they needed to flee to Saxony due to religious persecution. And there they came in contact with the Count of Zinzendorf, and together at Herrnhut they founded a religious community that also sent many missionaries around the world. And John Wesley was in Herrnhut, and he was influenced by them. And what he got new revelations about scripture and about God. And one of the things that he received was that he didn't in the Methodist movement, they did not believe in predestination anymore. Earlier faiths always believe, also in the Christian faith, people believed that it was predestined if one will be saved or not. And the Methodists believed that this is not anymore predetermined, but it's dependent on personal choice. And so they believe that everyone can receive salvation, and therefore also had a lot more focus on missionary activities, which is also why they were in the American colonies, and this Methodist movement was not only spreading in England but also in the American colonies, or later the USA, which was then founded. And the founding of the USA, as we will see later, which was also hugely impacted by this Methodist movement. And what's interesting about this is that in later times, the French philosopher Elie Halevi studied this period during the Methodist movement, and he realized that there was no bloody revolution that took place in England. And this prevention of violently enforced social changes could not be explained, since the economic and political circumstances seem to be the same, for example, to those of France. And in France, as we know, there was the French Revolution, which, however, had fatal consequences. The Jacobins, led by Maximilien de Robespierre, they created a reign of terror after this revolution, which killed many people just for being suspected to be enemies of the revolution. And Elie Halevi came to the conclusion that the Methodist movement was the reason that the same did not occur in England, and he said Methodism was the antidote to Jacobinism. So it was the antidote to this terror reign by the Jacobins. And Halevi himself was not a Christian, but and therefore this even shows that the Christian faith had such a positive influence that it was even recognized by non-Christians. So I think this shows that the Christian faith has been, in fact, a positive influence in those times. But that's not the only thing that happened in those times. On the other side of the globe, there was another revolution, and that did not end in senseless bloodshed, but resulted in a completely new form of government. With rising taxes and without fulfilling the demands for proper representations by the Britons, the American colonies decided to declare their independence. And this led to the Revolutionary War with Great Britain. And Great Britain, as the mightiest nation at that time, was highly in favor of winning this revolution. But due to France supporting the Americans and many other happy chances, the American cause succeeded against all odds, and this way the United States of America were born. And the fact that this revolution is in such a contrast to the many other revolutions in Europe around the time has many reasons. One of the reasons is definitely the deep Christian faith that many of the so-called founding fathers shared. George Washington was known for his faith, and the founding documents, especially the Declaration of Independence, refer to the Creator. In the Declaration of Independence, it relatively at the beginning, it says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." So this shows that there was a referral to the Creator. So there was a deep Christian faith that led them to write these documents. The founding father and second president John Adams said that their constitution was only made for moral and religious people, and that it's wholly inadequate to the government of any other. So this emphasis on the importance of and the necessity of the Christian faith can be seen through the writings of the first Americans, and even Benjamin Franklin, who wasn't a Christian himself, had a deep appreciation of the Christian faith. And he also attended events of John Wesley and George Whitefield, who were both Methodist preachers. Benjamin Franklin, furthermore, was a researcher and inventor. He is known for having invented the lightning rod, And especially in the realm of electricity, he made many discoveries. And it's also interesting that the Methodist preacher Jonathan Edwards had a propensity towards faith, and he published many of his own studies about several scientific topics. And he was convinced that there was an interpretation of the scientific data that was in agreement with the statements of the Bible. When I wrote my book, I had the same thought without even knowing about Edwards at that time. So I think it's undeniable that the Christian faith had a huge impact on the formation of the United States, with and with that on the founding of the first liberal democracy. But despite those big progresses during the time, the circumstances in Europe and America weren't perfect. Especially slavery was still existing during that time. Many nations in Europe engaged in the slave trade, and also in the USA, slaves were kept in the Deep South. Many of the founding fathers were already huge opponents of slavery, but they could not achieve its abolition due to southern states which were highly in favor of slavery. Believing that their liberal form of government would sooner or later lead to slavery being abolished, they decided to leave it for now. And they seemed right. First, the slave trade in Europe was abolished, particularly through the Christian William Wilberforce. And furthermore, in the US, there was an abolitionist movement that emerged, which was mainly or almost completely led by Christians. And they gained such an influence that with Abraham Lincoln, the first Republican became president, and Lincoln was a huge opponent of slavery. This led to the southern state to secede immediately, resulting in the Civil War, in the American Civil War, which eventually was won by the northern states. And since they had abolished slavery during the war, this meant that slavery was now abolished throughout the USA. And as we can see, this abolition of slavery was highly impacted by the Christian faith. And there are many more examples which you can name where the Christian faith had a positive impact on science and society. For example, the movement Weiße Rose, or in English White Rose, that fought against Nazism was led by Hans and Sophie Scholl, who were pious Christians. Also, the Bekennende Kirche, or Confessing Church, of Dietrich Bonhoeffer resisted the Nazi regime. Both eventually died for their fight. Furthermore, the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s was highly influenced by the Christian preacher Martin Luther King Jr. So over and over, faith has had a positive impact. But one thing needs to be noted here, because one might comment that there were also opponents of these progresses that also invoked their faith in this. One example might be Galileo Galilei, who got into conflicts with the Catholic Church due to his scientific endeavors. However, he himself remained a believer throughout his life and believed that there was always an interpretation that was in accord with the statements of the Bible. So there was an interpretation of the scientific data that was in accord with the Bible. The clerics at this time did not have this belief. Therefore, you can see it like this, that his faith was even greater than the one of his critics. Furthermore, his scientific discoveries did not put doubt on the statements of the Bible, but the interpretation of those statements by the Catholic Church. Hence, it was not about the authority of Scripture, but about the authority of the institution of the Church. It is also true that slaveholders tried to use the Bible to justify slavery. But that this was nonsense can be easily seen by the fact that they gave their slaves a censored version of the Bible with passages critical to slavery missing. For example, the Philemon Epistle. And the National Socialists of Nazi Germany tried to Aryanize Christianity by rewriting scripture such that Jesus was not a Jew anymore, and many other rewritings. That this had nothing to do with faith and was solely driven by ideology is obvious. And that's what was always the problem. Not the Christian faith itself, but the attempt to justify any ideology using faith even when this was not possible at all. So, what blocks scientific and societal progress is hence not faith, but ideologies of any kind. As I also state in my book, this is not a problem of the past, but also today ideologies are blocking progress in certain areas. So the fruit of faith is therefore apparent. It has also had a positive impact on science and society. Those were only a few examples, but they show that faith did not block progress, but to the contrary, it enabled it. To me, that's one of the greatest evidences that a Christian faith is indeed true. And also in the future, I think true progress will only be possible through the influence of the Christian faith. So this was today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it and liked the content. If you want to read it also in text form or want to send it around to read it, you can also find it in text, or at least the content in text, maybe in some different form, but you will find it on my webpage at my blog, and there you can read also the text to this podcast. Furthermore, I mentioned my book several times. Unfortunately, this is right now only exists in German. But if you can read German, then you can order it also on my webpage. If you can read German or listen to German, you can also listen to the German version of my podcast, where I also do a lot of introduction into physical topics, which is very interesting, and I also always interpret them in the Christian faith. So natural principles are always interpreted in the Christian faith, which is pretty interesting, I think. But if if you cannot read German or understand it, then just you can write me a message, and then I know that there is demand for an English version of the book. So if you want to contact me, you can use the contact form on my webpage. Just if you have questions about the podcast, if you have topics about science and or faith that you want to have answered in this podcast, just feel free to write me a message in the contact form at my webpage. You will find me on social media, where I also post stuff mostly in German. So feel free to check those out. And if you like this podcast, then recommend it to your friends or to people who you think might be interested, and share it with them. And in the next podcast episode, I think I will be talking about something which I will call culture versus anti-culture, and watch the Christian stance in it. I will try to make it as less political as possible, but I think it's a topic that shows, especially as a Christian, where we should position ourselves when we as Christians, while we are not living according to this world, are still living in this world. I think it will be a pretty interesting episode, so be sure to tune into that, and have a great time till then. Bye.